Good afternoon. Welcome to the Russia panel, or as this year an ode to Sir Winston Churchill. Thank you. We called it Russia, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Unfortunately, 70 years after the statement, Russia still remains a mystery to most of us. And those of us who are not from Russia or doing business in Russia, we're always faced with questions that shows how little people understand Russia nowadays. My name is Alex Kovaler. I'll be moderating the panel. I've spent the last 25 years working and living in Russia. I was the first head of AT&T in still Soviet Union. I ran RC Coal International in Eastern Europe, based out of Moscow. I ran a major Russian media company and founded a number of American brands like GNC, Wendy's, and Nathan's Famous in Russia. Most recently, I launched a new company focused on helping people do business in Russia. And I've advised companies like IMG Sports, Petco, Pandora Jewelry, Discovery Land Company, amongst others. We have a really distinguished panel today. I mean, in my 7 or 8 years that I've been involved with Milken Institute on the Russian theme, I think this is the most diverse and interesting panel that I've seen from all walks of life, both government and business. Let me introduce everyone to you before we start. On my left, Steve Hellman, the former head of Credit Suisse. Also, like myself, an old guard expat American. Maxim Oreshkin, the Deputy Minister of Finance of Russia, and one of the architects of Russia's macroeconomic response to sanctions. Erik, Rudyak, a young man whose short life, I think, reads like an exciting crime novel with a happy ending. I think Erik have done a lot of things from being kidnapped to building Olympic projects in Sochi. We have Mark Garber, chairman of BCH Group. Really an incredibly interesting man who started as I think psychoanalyst, a therapist for the party apparatchiks, to becoming a media mogul and real estate mogul in Russia. I'm very honored to have him here. And then also, last but not least, Erik Berglöf, a professor at London School of Economics and one of the leading economists on Russia. As a matter of fact, his position as chief economist at EBRD served a long way to making investments in Russia, high-profile investments, very successful. If I may start with Steve. Steve and I both were on this panel 2 years ago, shortly after sanctions came into play, the initial sanctions, just a few months after the Sochi Olympics, very successful Olympics for Russia. Russia was in an upswing, full of pride, full of nationalism. And then the initial sanctions hit. And we actually, our panel was just several months after the initial sanctions. And at that point, I think, Steve, you came up with a term that was a panel of morbid curiosity. That's right. Because we had a room several times larger than this. People came out to see just how was Russia going to respond to initial sanctions. So why don't you share with us what happened
Alex,
2 years later?
I actually think when we did the panel 2 years ago, it was right before the major sanctions had come into place. And at that point, we were all more or less just in a state of shock because, right after the euphoria of Sochi, things went so badly so quickly. And you can ask yourself, how does that happen? But then you realize in Russia, that's just the way things tend to occur. And then sanctions really came into place in, I think it was July, when the plane went down.
If I may interrupt, I think the initial sanctions actually already took place when we had our panel because.
But the sectoral ones?
The initial sanctions were around Putin's circle, so we saw a lot of personal sanctions directed at his circle, which was interpreted very, very personal. We also saw people losing their credit cards because some of the banks owned by his people close to him who owned banks, all of a sudden the Visa and credit cards, MasterCards were not working. So Russia instituted, a threat of freezing, of making Visa and MasterCard pay $3 to $4 billion in a holding account because that's how much Russians spend per day in Russia today. So but I think they avoided that. But the sanctions were initially in place.
But when the sectoral sanctions came into place that summer, that was when we really became concerned. At that time, Russia, had a $300 billion or so, foreign debt load. there was a real concern about, what impact that would have on the banking sector, how would it fund itself, and what would happen to the economy as a result. But as is often the case, Russia did adapt, so much so that only last week Sberbank, which is the leading bank in Russia, basically took deposit rates down to zero because the banking system is so flush with liquidity currently. And as I've spoken with people in the government, and Maxim can actually comment when he speaks later, I actually do have a sense, and actually listening to Putin in his marathon press conference a couple of weeks ago, that sanctions are in a way part of government policy now. I think they fully expect that they will be in place for a very long time to come. And in a perverse sense, I think the government has come to the conclusion that one of the ways to spur investment in Russia going forward is actually for, believe it or not, sanctions to remain in place because they have a protective, effect and enable, parts of the economy to develop, particularly agriculture, in a way that they couldn't, if Russia had to adhere to the WTO and have, effectively open borders. And then after we got past sanctions, and then people realized they were going to be in place for a long time, and we all, sort of calmed down a bit. Well, then the next shoe to drop was the oil price. But, and people said, well, gee, if the oil price is going to be at $20 or $30, the country's, obviously going to, suffer very badly. But let's remember one thing, even at $100 oil, Russia was not growing. And in fact, the economy, if anything, was really beginning to stagnate, even around the time of Sochi and just in the year before. So, I think it comes down to the question is, what is the fundamental issue with Russia if it's not really sanctions and if it's not the oil price? And I think fundamentally the issue is that the investment climate is just, as we've said over and over again in the number of years that we've been here, the investment climate is certainly not conducive enough to encouraging people to come and build or invest in the economy. And the reasons for that are several. And this is getting a lot of press now. There was it's been all over the news in the last couple of weeks. There was a big forum in Moscow about 3 weeks ago for the Moscow Exchange that Navalny spoke at and Kudrin. And everybody was really focused on hammering on the need for structural reforms. And I think some of the issues that the country faces are the following. One is a demographic issue. The country has 145 million people, but it is not that population is not growing, and if anything, it only recently stopped receding or falling off. Interestingly, Russia's employment rate almost has full employment, so there's really no excess capacity, even in the case that there were investment available for new industries. And I think the big issues, at least in my mind, are the continuing interference or major participation of the government in the economy, which is that the state-owned enterprises really stand over the commanding heights of the economy, whether it's in the oil and gas industry or other major areas of the economy. And as we all know, and as we've seen in other emerging markets, state-owned enterprises tend to be extremely bureaucratic and inefficient. And I think until Russia can successfully privatize this industry and encourage more private participation in these very important sectors, it is going to be difficult for the economy to press forward and grow in a meaningful way. And then I think the last issue, and I've been harping on this for years and years, is there are institutional barriers to development. And whether that is the absence of an independent judiciary, or something as simple as the absence of a free press, things that we take for granted in the West. Until those institutions really develop in a meaningful way, I think it is going to be meaningful impediments to development of the economy. It actually brings to mind the situation that we're facing now in Russia since Sochi and since the real deterioration in the West is quite similar to the climate that I experienced last in the 1980s, in fact 1985 when I was a student in Russia during the Soviet era, in the height of the Cold War. And it actually brings to mind, if you can get a sense as to how bad the propaganda climate is, I'll give you an anecdote, which is actually from the Soviet era, and a head of a big private company reminded me of it the other day, and it goes something like this. There's a road race, and Leonid Brezhnev and Richard Nixon are participating in it. They're the only two participants in the race. So TASS, which is the government news agency, reports about the race. And it says a road race was run. Leonid Brezhnev and Richard Nixon were participants in the race. Leonid Ilyich gave a very spirited performance, and he came in second place. Richard Nixon came in second to last. Richard Nixon came in first, and Leonid Brezhnev came in second. So, but that really is a sense as to the climate that we're facing. My base case going forward is, the major question is, will the government take action? And I think the major concern is that with the 16 parliamentary elections and the 18 presidential elections, it's unlikely, the base case, that they're going to do anything meaningful, even though a lot of people are really demanding structural reform. Because Putin really faces a dilemma. He's campaigned consistently on the fact that he is not going to go back to the 90s, where very systemic, meaningful reform, was cataclysmic. And there were, he claims, 10 million plus deaths as a result of a very difficult, transition from the Soviet era to a market economy. And so for him to move forward with a very systematic reform of the Russian economy, there is a real concern that there will be grave consequences as a result of that. So I think what we face as a base case is sort of limited half steps. And that probably means that the economy's ability to perform at 3, 4, 5% growth rate, which is really what is I think required for the economy meaningfully to transform over time, that's probably unlikely.
Well, I mean, Maxim, perhaps you could respond to some of these comments.
Almost all of them.
As I expected, I think certainly the appointment of Kudrin just last week to a new position in the cabinet is an indication of Putin's intentions. But I think I'll let you speak to that, especially as you and I had discussed previously. There's been a lot of positive indicators in 2016 versus 2015 from the numbers. So maybe you can share those with us.
Well, maybe I will start with some points that Steve have raised. With views like he should be definitely out of China, because the role of the state-owned enterprises there is much, much higher. I'm not talking about the press. It's also a separate story. He also should be out of Mexico, for example, where the oil industry is fully under the control of the government, unlike in Russia, where we have a quite significant share of the private equity even in the oil and gas industry. I'm not talking about other industries. The other story is about structural shifts. Actually, what Russia have experienced in the past year is the major structural shifts, which is what was not witnessed almost in any emerging markets for decades, I would say so. The reason behind the slowdown in the growth before all the shocks that we have, and shocks were enormous. For example, last year, within just 1 year, we have absorbed 10 percentage points decline of GDP and exports. And the additional shock coming from the sanctions was on top of that 3 percentage point of GDP. So despite all those shocks, we've arrived by the end of 2015 in a situation with the current account surplus and no external financing needs for the economy. We were repaying all the debts. Despite all the sanctions that we implemented, we were paying down all the debts, both the sovereign and the companies. The external debt have declined within just a couple of years from $700 to $500 billion. But the story behind the growth slowdown that we were experiencing, it was a direct effect of the Dutch disease, I would say so, because we were using all the proceeds that we had from the high level of oil and gas prices. We were using it domestically. There was sharp ruble appreciation. There was sharp depression of the share of the corporate profits within the GDP. And what we have experienced in the past year, during the 2015, it was kind of reversal. So we did not only the adjustment to the shocks that we have, and now, you can look at countries like Brazil, South Africa, and so on and so forth, where there is no stability in terms of macroeconomic development. What we see in Russia now, slowing down inflation, it's 7% already, down from 16% a year ago. GDP is already on the upward path in the recent months. So what has happened besides the adjustment is, of course, major structural shifts. We have a significant increase in the share of the corporate profits of GDP, and the primary reason behind the slowdown in investment activity was much lower margins comparing with the first decade of 2000s. For example, if you look at on all the tradables where the prices have increased significantly comparing with rest of the prices within the economy, the price structure have shifted a lot in Russia. Just in a couple of years, we had 30% increase in tradable CPI, 20% increase in non-tradables, and just 10% nominal increase in wages. And this, of course, resulted in a significant redistribution of income within the economy towards the businesses in the tradable part of the economy, where the margins have expanded a lot. And those who is doing the business now in the tradable area in Russia is doing pretty well. For example, just one example is agriculture, where the operating margins were roughly 7-8% before the shocks. Now it's 20%. It's, I can list you a number of industries. It's like wood industry, metallurgy, chemical industry, domestic.
But we're also seeing a lot of investment in agriculture from the outside, especially Asia. Recently, the Russian Direct Investment Fund, which is the Russian sovereign wealth fund, announced a $1.6 billion co-investment with a group from Thailand to invest in Russia. So, we're seeing some investment from Asia that would normally come from US and Europe. So we are seeing a lot more capital coming into Russia as a result in these sectors, which are vastly underdeveloped.
That's right. The state that we have currently is that companies are running wider margins, but they not get used to it. So at the first stage, it was evident, for example, in the second half of last year, companies were mainly deleveraging themselves. They were using increased cash flows to repay the debt, including external one. Now they are switching towards the investment cycle, towards new wave of investment activity. Industries like in chemical industry, we had 30% increase in investment activity last year. So what has happened in 2015 in Russia, as the reaction to the shock, which was even bigger than the shock of 80s for the Soviet Union. All those structural shifts that happened, they are actually building the new model for growth, which is based on the tradables. We have the real effective exchange rate, which now is in line with the fundamentals and not depressing the activity across the economy like it was happening in the past couple of years. So that's it.
Thank you, Maxim. So we go from two polarizing views, and I think we'll move to a more neutral position with Mark, who's been very successful in the early 80s. So I think you've seen a number of ups and downs in the
yeah, as Alex said, I'm a trained psychiatrist, so I'm well prepared to stay in Russia. So would recommend to start with this if you want to enter the border. But having said that, really, I started after being psychiatrist and all in parallel with that, I started my business 30 years ago, one of the first ventures back in Soviet Union, in classic way, starting with music records and then switching to oil, gas, metals, God knows what.
What else?
And whatever. Just I can talk about hides, timber. So, and finally ending in 1994 being one of the first investment bankers that we've put together with my partner those days, who was one of the biggest fans of Russia, Berglöf. He was the head of CSFB those days. So after stepping down from this position, we've launched together one of the first independent investment banks. So we lived a long history, and one of the Russian classics said, to understand Russia, one should live long. So that's truly so, because if I look back 30 years ago, and I would be told 30 years ago that I'm going to be seated in LA and talking to this conference about the independent economics in Russia, no one would believe that, because it's an unbelievable change. And I was very much involved in citizen diplomacy those days in the 80s, with the institute located pretty close in Big Sur, Esalen. And we were taking Americans to Soviet Union and were trying to break the borders and doing all the possible stuff. So compared to that, what we have today is fantastic. Can Russia move one way in an understandable, democratic way? My answer is no, because it has such a long history and such a complicated understanding of itself, and people who have these emotional turn-ups. So that's why it is difficult to treat it in a sort of a very, very mechanical approach. It's much more complicated. So I think that if you have an objective figures, and having lived through the crises that Russia lived through these 30 years, we can say that every crisis was a drama. It was a disaster. It was a catastrophe. Everyone was panicking, leaving the market, withdrawing every penny from there, selling everything to nil. And then it happened that in a few years they were making the best money. There were others who would be staying either because they were stupid or because they were wise. And looking backwards, I'm saying to myself how stupid I was when it was necessary to buy everything. And people made hundreds and thousands of % on their investment those days. Have people lost money in Russia? Yes, they have, of course. And there are many stories when people have lost money. But again, the stories of disaster, they are much more loud than the stories of success. And success is always very quiet because people want to continue doing that rather than coming out and say, hey, I'm doing this, follow me. So today, again, having this balanced view and having asset management in Russia, so I can see a bit the picture that is, again, not based on words, but on figures. And we run the biggest property fund now in Russia, which is quite successful, again. And we have some operations in this industry. I should say that really I would agree with Maxim. We've passed this sort of the worst point that was a shock after introducing the sanctions, after losing investments into the country. I think we came to the point when there is really recovery now. And I can come with the slides and figures, but I don't want to do that because it's much more important to draw your attention to few things that will stay in place. It's very difficult to just delete Russia off the world's map. So it's technically impossible. And listening today to very wise words of Admiral Mullen, who says very, I think, right and common sense things about dealing with Russia. It's necessary to continue dialogue, and I think that's what we are all hoping for. We should say that Russia has definitely the shortest way from Asia to Europe, and you cannot miss it, just by definition, so that stays as at least the corridor of goods going back and forth. It has one of the best natural resource base, which one way or another is going to be consumed by humanity. It has a vast territory that can produce agricultural goods, and it has quite qualified people. Now with the devaluation of rubles, when we have the labor that is cheaper than in most of the countries of Southeast Asia.
But if I may, it's almost a test for the West as well. I mean, the U.S. has, I think 20 or 30 countries that are on a sanctions list, in likes of Somalia, Chad, North Korea.
Yeah. This
is something different. This is the 6th largest economy in the world. It's the largest country by landmass in the world. Sanctioning a country like that is very different.
It is. I would totally agree. And if you will also imagine that out of 140 million of Russian population, 115 live in the European part of Russia. So it's part of Europe. It's the biggest European consumer market, which you cannot sort of, again, separately forget. And that's why Europe is suffering so much from this sanctions.
300,000 jobs in Germany
Absolutely.
alone are tied to a Russian economy.
So, having said all that, now we see that there are definite opportunities. And we see now that this, what is named the replacement of imported goods with a domestic production is really starting taking place. Agriculture is booming because now having ruble costs and dollar earnings, well, amazing. If you go for titanium production of my friends with Avisma, who supplies Boeing, and all because of that, all the titanium comes from Russia for Boeing, they are just enjoying the sanctions. They are praying to keep them as long as possible. If you go to the producers of potash, it's the same story. So if you look into these industries that are export-oriented, they're benefiting a lot from the sanctions. Those who are dependent on the imported goods, they suffer. And that's why they come with ideas how to replace these import goods with the domestic production. And that's how we see now that those guys who are brave enough and who start the domestic production, they benefit as well. So we are passing through the third crisis, which I remember. I think that I have all the feeling that we are getting out of it. We've built 3 big office centers in St. Pete, which we've totally sort of leased out, thanks a lot to the biggest company, Gazprom. And I can tell you that half of St. Petersburg stays virtually empty with office center. Why we were successful? Because we've done everything in the proper way. So what I say, the crisis really discovers who does things really in a decent, normal, serious way. If you have a good product, you have strong position. If you try to do something in an integrity way, yes, it's seen immediately. I view these opportunities that come today as really opportunities maybe of the last reshuffling of the potential wealth in Russia, maybe for the next long-term period. I wouldn't go into the sort of a complexity of the political life in Russia. I'm talking not just money-wise. I think that we'll be remembering this time as the time of the maybe missed opportunities, or maybe those ones who used it as taken ones.
Excellent, excellent. This is very good, Mark. Thank you. I'd like to go to Erik, representing sort of the newer generation of Russians. Erik, maybe you can share your story of how you came to Russia via U.S. and back to Russia, and what you do now, including your successful project building Olympics.
Erik is actually Erik is a short version of Ernest in Russia, in case everyone's wondering why he's calling me Erik. So yeah, I was born in Moscow in the Soviet Union and moved to the United States in 1992 after I was kidnapped from preschool in 1991. Returned very quickly, but my father decided probably be best for me to grow up elsewhere. And since we had the opportunity, we went to Boston. So I went K through 12 in Boston, went to university out here in Los Angeles, finished USC with a civil engineering degree. And halfway through my through my education here, my father passed away, unfortunately. At the age of 47, he was much too young. And my brother and I were kind of thrown into the void to run the family business. The same month that he passed away, it was May 2007, the Forbes article that came out in Russia rated him, ranked him at number 64 richest person in the country. So we had a very large business that we had to take over. I was 20, my brother was 25. No one thought that we had a chance. I'm happy to say we proved everyone wrong. That being said, moved back in 2007 for the summer. Took over a concrete factory, cleaned up a lot of the things that were going on there. We had a person who was running it who was selling through his own intermediate company, and so we were making a profit of about $350,000 a month. By the time that I went back to university in August, I slightly increased it up to just over $1 million a month without really having to do much. And then my brother said, you know what, go back, finish your education, and then you can come and help me. So 2009, graduated on the 15th of May. The 18th, I was on a plane. 19th, I landed. 20th, I was in the office with a civil engineering degree, and my brother told me to run the shopping center. So I had to figure out how to run retail in Russia, but I think that's actually kind of something that is quite indicative of Russia. People who had degrees in various fields are doing things that have absolutely nothing to do with their degrees. I believe it's almost 80% of the people are involved in fields that have absolutely nothing to do with what they were educated in. So Russia, as was mentioned earlier, they have a lot of very talented people, a lot of very brilliant minds that are able to adjust and are able to roll with the punches. And it's been a very, very turbulent period over the last 25 years since Russia became a country known as the Russian Federation. And in that 25 years, the changes have been drastic. Many things, I believe, if you were told 25 years ago about Russia, no one would believe it. The same thing goes about 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. I'm sure that where we will be 2-3 years from now will also be a surprise for everyone. It is the beginning stages. It's a very young country, and the progress has been, I would say, tremendous. And in my opinion, there is always an opportunity. If you look at 1998, when the country defaulted and everything crashed, between 1998 and 2008, the next crisis, the stock market rose, I think it's like 6,000%. Then it crashed again between 2009 and up until the sanctions and the oil prices took effect. It went up again by 400%. And now we are again at a new bottom. Is it the rock bottom? You never know. But I'll have to agree with my colleagues here that I think we've probably reached just about the bottom of where we will be at this crisis. It's, in a sense, artificially created. When the sanctions will be lifted, it's kind of above my pay grade to judge that. But there's big opportunity. There's still so much to be done. So many people have come from Europe, from America, from Asia with different ideas and projects that work in their respective countries, and they incorporated in Russia and had a big success. McDonald's probably being the first one, but since then, many companies have come in and created franchisees or created sub-companies in the country, and they're doing very well.
Erik, let me ask you a question. You know, you represent really the newer generation, right? And you know, you and your friends and you know, people of your age view Russia very different, with a different sense of being a Russian. And I think, you know, one of the things, and you know, and you can speak to this, you know, that is hard to understand in the West is I think President Putin, despite his criticism in the West, has brought a sense of nationalism, patriotism in Russia that hasn't existed for a long time. I mean, how does your generation view this in Russia today?
You know, it's mixed. You'll find people who hate him, you'll find people who love him. He's got a very high support rate, and I would say it's justifiably so. A lot of people, they don't ask questions, they make statements saying he's doing this wrong, he's doing this wrong, but they don't ask the right question, is there someone that could have done a better job? And then you take a look at what condition he took the country in and where he brought it to, and you see that he's made great leaps and strides. I mean, he has to work with the tools he has at hand. He can't snap his fingers and make every politician an honest politician. He can't snap his fingers and make every person an honest person. And the fact of the matter is that the new generation is growing up with a completely different mentality. Many people are getting education like I did in foreign jurisdictions. They have different point of views, and they do argue over what's good and what's bad. They have opinions, and it's something that wasn't possible 30 years ago. Wasn't even conceivable. And now, I mean, I have some heated debates with my friends about what Mr. Putin is doing right or doing wrong, but I believe he is doing the best he can. And it's hard when it's the world against you. And he really is in a hot seat. Many countries, for some reason, still see Russia as kind of the enemy. I mean, Hollywood's done a great job villainizing us, but it's I would say it's not fair, in a sense. And many of the people who come to Moscow, first of all, everyone is surprised by the city if they haven't been there and they don't know anything about it. Everyone is surprised by the people because I still get questions to this day. Is it always cold there? Don't you have polar bears walking around the streets? Like, no.
Moscow is one of the safest, largest cities in the world. I mean, it's very easy to walk around, very easy to enjoy yourself and have access to everything. And most people just don't understand. Well, I was sitting at a dinner yesterday with a gentleman who was an opera fan and a theater fan, and he was saying, "It's been my life dream to go to see the Bolshoi Theater, but I'm afraid to go to Moscow. And I said, no, I just didn't understand why. You know, it's these stereotypes that we've been fighting for years.
You should be afraid going to New York rather than to Moscow, actually.
You know, I think it's a question also of the luxury of free press in the United States. Yes, okay, I agree, but there's so many things that I believe that is not actually as transparent as is made to seem here. For example, after the whole incident with Crimea, I'm in Miami visiting my brother, and I'm watching the news. I wake up in the morning, I turn on the news, and they're showing, the music sounds like a horror movie or an action movie. They're saying tanks, and they're showing parades of tanks in Russia, and they're mobilizing their army, and they're going to, it looked like they were about
march
to start,
on to
we're
Europe,
about to start
you know.
World War III. And then I'm sitting like, what the heck is going on? And I look at my calendar, and I'm like, oh, it's May 9th. That's the national parade that we have every year on May 9th to celebrate the victory of the war. It
World
has
War
absolutely
II.
nothing to do with not mobilizing troops, and that's what they're showing on TV. So people read the headlines. Same thing happened in 2008 with Georgia, where in the headlines it said Russia attacked Georgia. And then found out that actually Georgia invaded this little region, which then Russia came in to kind of protect, and they killed 10% of the population within a few days. And none of that was covered here in the States. Actually, if you look at, I think, CNN, they're showing videos of riots happening in Moscow, people throwing, and there's fires, and there's palm trees in the background, because that's actually riots from Athens, Greece. And then the kind of not the justification, the reciprocation was where they come back and they say they were wrong. It happens on page 26, 28. Well, the headlines is what people remember. And that really is one of the big issues. Yes, it's free press, but I would say it's kind of free press in quotations. It really is still, I would say, highly polarized.
Thank you, Erik.
Actually, you know that it's not a problem of Russia in most of the cases. It's a problem of investors who are not investing. Because, you know, those funds, and we are making a lot of funds in the EM space, those who were on the sidelines in the past year, they underperforming the benchmarks. They're doing worse than the rest of their competitors.
Thank you. Now, we leave the last for you, Erik, and sort of the sober voice, the real economist, to give us sort of the summary of and your sober view of Russia and where it's going. And I think you didn't agree with the title of this panel because you thought Russia is easy to read.
Well, I think talking about the economy, I think it is actually a little bit easier. Certainly, there's not much mystery there, I think. But I remember my Russian teacher used to say, there are two types of people who say that Russian is a difficult language. Those who succeeded to learn it and those who failed to learn it. So I think there is a little bit of that going on around Russia. So I think there is a danger with thinking of the Russian economy as a mystery. And I think there is a tendency, particularly in the Russian policy debate, to think of Russia as being exceptional and that not having to deal with the same kind of issues or very specific problems that Russia has to deal with. And of course, there's no question that Russia has a unique history, has a vast landmass and so on. But actually, I would argue that Russia has become much more like a normal country, and I mean now a normal emerging economy with a lot of resources. And you can, if you look at Russia's growth over the period when it started growing, sort of late 90s, early 2000s, until the global financial crisis, the growth was essentially what we call total factor productivity, so improvements in productivity. So very little from additional labor, very little from additional capital, and relatively little from improvements in the human capital. And what was that about? Well, that was about getting rid of these incredible inefficiencies that were there in Soviet times. And Russia was very successful and had a fantastic period. It was helped by oil prices and so on. But it was a terrific period, and particularly the way, and I was very close to this process in Russia in the early 2000s, how, and I don't think we appreciate fully how successful those early reforms were. Then comes the crisis, the global financial crisis. Russia was hit a little bit earlier because of its oil exposure, and it had certain weaknesses that made it the G20 economy most affected by the crisis. But then it picked up. It took 4 or 5 years to get back to where it was before. And then come the sanctions, and then comes the oil price. And I would argue that so Russia's had, we spoke about those 3 crises. The first one, was a massive shock, default, financial sector collapse. But actually the financial sector was not very important for the economy at the time, and the economy picked up very quickly after. In the crisis, in the global financial crisis, Russia had certain things going on. It had a very non-transparent banking system. It had very large exposures that were not fully understood. It had a few other issues that made it so effective. But it recovered from that. What's happening now, and this is where I think some of the numbers here have to be put in perspective, what's happening now is that it's really hitting capacity constraints in almost every sector. I think agriculture is an exception, but in almost every other sector it's hitting capacity constraints because of lack of investment. Because for a long time, these improvements that were realized in that period, successful period of the 2000s, those improvements are no longer there to be had. Now you really need new investment in new technology and so on, and that's not happening. And how will it happen? It will happen, I think, the kind of reforms that Maxim Oreshkin talked about. I think that's what is needed, and it is very encouraging that over the last, I would say, couple of months, there's a clear different attitude, I think, and the appointment of Kudrin for this position, and his being charged with leading an effort to write the reform program for the government is a major step in the right direction. But this is what Russia needs. Russia needs very serious reforms to improve the structural, or to improve the investment climate, because that's the only way that Russia is going to be able to grow out of its.
But Erik, would you say, in summary, do you think sanctions have worked? Have they really been effective? Because if you look at who they're geared towards, and I look at even in myself, in our business, the GNC business, we're in process of expanding, and we received a loan of $5 million from OPEC, which was suspended when sanctions came in, right? Same thing with EBRD, obviously, was shut down from invest. So, the whole purpose of sanctions, was to hurt the Putin administration, but in essence, it was hurting people who were, the middle class, or the middle businesses and companies that were trying to actually make the country better.
No, I saw this very close by because I was in EBRD when we became an instrument of sanctions. And what you realize when you sit and think about sanctions, so we were told you cannot do any more new investments. Well, new investments, what is a new investment? Is sort of a refinancing of an existing investment. We had to make all these kind of decisions on a daily basis. And what you do is that you try, and particularly, of course, if you're a public institution like EBRD, but I think it's also if you're a financial institution, you're trying to make sure that you in no way can be perceived as breaking the sanctions. So even if the sanctions were very narrow, and I agree with that, they were targeting individuals first and then sectoral, the amount of efforts that these banks had to undertake to make sure that they did not break against the sanctions was enormous. So I would say that the impact was certainly very large in the beginning. What's happening now is, of course, that people are learning how to work around these sanctions, and there are some things that are happening, and again, agriculture is a good example, is happening that wouldn't have happened otherwise. Of course, Russia has fantastic possibilities in agriculture, and it would be a very healthy thing for Russia to develop its agriculture.
Because in many ways it was much more convenient to import things rather than build its own infrastructure. And so now, there's an internal correction to build these infrastructures, to build these systems.
I remember, being in Moscow in the 90s, you could hardly find a Russian-produced grocery. You could all yogurt were some imported.
No, it's very comical, and I really want to share this. You can go into there's a leading Russian supermarket chain, which is like a Whole Foods comparable to here, and you would have the same factory, so it would be a Danone yogurt made in Russia. In one section would cost $1, and it would be Danone yogurt, same flavor, same everything, from France for $5, and it would always be sold out, because there was such little trust in Russian products. And as a result of the situation now, we see a whole growth of organic products, quality products, because it almost weeds out the inferior producers. So it's been a big boost for the local producers.
Yeah, and you can say there are other industries. It's not for the same reason, but if you look at the car industry, for example, in Russia, it's an incredible success story. Of course, now it's a bit more difficult, but what you saw was that around these car factories you got suppliers and you got training centers and so on. So you built whole sort of ecosystems around the car industry that I think has been some of the success stories of Russia's economic development. But the fact remains that Russia has not been able to attract investment to the extent that it deserves. And it has not, and that's both about foreign investment, but it's of course mostly about Russian investment, and maybe Russian investments of Russian money abroad, but wherever it is, that's what needed now to break against these capacity constraints that it has.
Thank you. One last question to Maxim before we go to questions is, as a government representative, do you think there was a big expectations of Asian capital coming in and replacing American and European capital? Has that happened?
Well, not that much. It's actually Russian capital replaces the external capital. What we have achieved in the past year is we did the adjustment, the way, and the way that we are not dependent on the inflows. Unlike countries like Brazil, Argentina, Turkey, or other countries which are really dependent on the inflows from the foreign investors. In Russia, in terms of financial investors, we really do not need external financing as of now. Now, it was already mentioned on the panel that Russian banks are awash of the foreign currency liquidity as of now, and zero rates of the deposits means that simply no external financing is needed. What is needed, of course, it's the technology, it's managerial technology, which is important to have stronger growth and more quality investments going forward.
But clearly, it's more expensive to attract Western professionals with the ruble being what it is versus a dollar.
Well, but at the same time, if you look at the corporate sector, once again, the tradable part of it, you'll find out that the margins there are much, much wider. So there's much more opportunities. And those businesses, for example, which are staying in Russia and doing the business in Russia, they are getting much bigger profits comparing with what they were getting a couple of years ago.
Alex, yes, on this, I think one thing that has not come up in this discussion is that, of course, Russia is not a monolith. I mean, there is enormous regional variation. So there are some really successful regions, and you saw it in every aspect. In every crisis, each region reacted very differently. Some of them really weathered the storm quite well, while others were hit very, very badly. So I think we tend to think of Russia as this one big monolith, and that's deceiving, and particularly if you're going to be doing business in Russia, you need to have a much more granular view of Russia.
Well, I mean, last thing I want to add is, and we didn't touch upon this today, but I mean, if you look at the security of Europe today in general, I mean, I think Europe is much better off having Russia as a partner in intel sharing and understanding the Muslim extremism with which Russia has dealt, in Central Asia and in Chechnya and other places. So I think in the big picture, and obviously we've seen this in Syria as well, I mean, the world is better off making peace with Russia rather than having Russia as an adversary. So with that, I think we have 7 or 8 minutes. If anybody has any questions.
Is this on? Yeah, hi. First of all, thank you very much for a really interesting insight to Russia today. Last week at the Bilkin Institute in London, we had Natalia Orlova, who's the chief economist of Alpha Bank, talk to our young leaders. And as you guys know, she's one of the most distinguished economists in Russia. One of the comments she made, which I thought was quite intriguing, was that in a recent opinion poll of graduates in Russia, the main or desirable job that they sought was to work for the government. So what does that say about the spirit of entrepreneurship in Russia, maybe to Erik or to Mark today, and what does that say about Russia in general? Thanks.
Maybe I'll start answering, despite you haven't asked me.
As a talented young politician.
You know, it's maybe was true several years ago, but what we are witnessing in the past couple of years, the situation is changing. Actually, there is a massive shift, you know, it's not only from the government roles, but also from the role in banks, in finance, and so on and so forth. So all those sectors that were performing extremely well in the past decade, they are now on the sidelines. So there are new leaders, new industries, and young people are more interested in doing businesses there, having a job there. So it's a shift that is also happening in this area.
Well, I mean, I can only really say my opinion on that. I haven't heard that the graduates are looking more for government jobs than jobs in other industries. But I think the potential, it's an opportunity for them to kind of give back and to maybe impart a change because it's becoming more and more effective as a means. And many of the politicians that have been running the country for the past 25 years, they did it through a prism of a Soviet education, a Soviet background. And a lot of the new generation, the young generation, they don't have that. They have internet, they have their own opinion, and they see things that they want to change. And I believe it could be a big factor in maybe why they want to go into the government jobs to try to improve what they would like to improve in their country.
Was that Natalia's point, that they wanted to become bureaucrats and work necessarily for the government, or they wanted to work for the government or state-owned enterprises?
Well, you know, I can tell you for sure, looking for a new personnel to join the Ministry of Finance, there is not that much, interest in it. You know? It was really hard to build a team which is in charge of the fiscal policy.
You know, James, I can counter with another statistics. I had in the private session dinner with Frank Lutz last night. You know, and we all know who Frank Lutz is. You know, I think the greatest pollster that there is. He said that in a recent polling, they asked 100 Americans aged 18 to 29 which system they want to grow up in. Capitalism, socialism, or socialism, capitalism, or communism. Thank you. And only 30% wanted capitalism.
These are all the Bernie Sanders supporters.
Yeah. But there's a lot more of them that you think. So.
I just, apart from all the economic things going on, and of course what brought on the sanctions and other things, what does Russia really want with regard to the initiatives related to Crimea and Ukraine, and also with the aggressive moves over the Balkans recently in terms of the jets and flying around?
Baltics, you mean?
The Baltics, I'm sorry, yeah. I'm just not sure, you know, where is this going? What messages are being sent to the West? And I think that's overriding the concerns of the West, and I think it overrides anybody that might think about investing in Russia.
I think we all expected this question. I think we all have very strong opinions, so I
will ask you the question, what actually the US wants to achieve by flying their planes near the Russian border, and what the US wanted to achieve in Libya, for example. So what would be your answer?
I'm a Canadian, so
I think the answer to your question, it's a question of realpolitik. I mean, I think the Russians are defining what they believe is their legitimate sphere of influence in much the way that the U.S. has and other great powers have, and I think it's as simple as that.
You have to go back to the days of Gorbachev and Senior Bush, you know, during the period when, you know, they struck a deal that NATO will never expand beyond a certain border, and it has. And the closer it gets to the Russian border, the more uncomfortable the Russians feel. And, you know, I think Crimea is a completely different subject altogether. And I think there's a lot of misconception about Crimea and the Russian minorities who who actually have a choice and they voted, just like Scotland had a vote and they voted to stay in UK. You know, and I think Crimea chose to stay in the Russian Federation because 85% of them are ethnic Russians.
I was going to say it's majority, not minority.
Sorry.
Hi. To the point, a couple of the panelists made this point on censorship and free press, and I agree. I live in Singapore, and probably one of the countries with the highest GDP per capita in the world, and we have complete censorship. So I don't think the two things are necessarily mutually exclusive, and it's about responsible press more than anything else. My question is, given that, obviously in Europe, given the size of the Russian consumer, Europe is not so much the problem, but I think the problem is predicated in Russia is that trade and capital flows from the West, namely the U.S., and it creates such a problem in terms of the highs and the lows. What can Russia do to, what are business leaders like yourselves doing to improve relationships here in the United States, but also given just the sheer size of the landmass that Russia has that's actually part of Asia, what are you guys doing in terms of economic cooperation with sort of the future, future business, future economies of the world, the Indias and the Chinas of the world, and could that really, improve Russia's standing globally?
If I may say, just from the point, saying what you do in person, it's quite a special question. So I think that Maxim can say what the government does, but on the personal level, as every businessman, it's normal to find all the possible opportunities. And we have, of course, connections and long-standing relations with American companies and friends, as well as with Europeans. And there was a serious pitch to Chinese companies after this Crimean story, which I think is not as successful as sort of the government was hoping to have, but still it's ongoing. And I would say that there is an increasing sort of attempt to look for different alternatives. The fact that the Prime Minister of Japan is on his way to Sochi now is, I think, another interesting manifestation, and then the forthcoming visit of President Putin to Japan definitely sort of whispers about potential discussion on the northern territories, which is a major issue for Russia. So that's all these symptoms show that there is always an attempt to do something, and definitely there will be a sort of chance for everyone to have an input in this process.
I would just add, my perception is that, because I'm pretty active in the Chamber of Commerce in Moscow, and I will tell you that most European business leaders and American business leaders are extremely frustrated by the current situation. They think Russia is an incredibly attractive market for the many reasons we discussed. But politically, they feel it's a difficult matter in light of the current political climate for them to, aggressively invest in the country. Notwithstanding the fact that the investment climate, at least from a legal perspective and a political perspective, has improved, and Russia is very eager to have this investment. But politically, it's just an issue for major Western companies.
Erik.
No, I just think we should have very realistic expectations about expanding this trade with China and so on. I think, and it certainly, the Chinese know how to negotiate, know how to detect weaknesses in partners. And the long-term future, at least for the next 20 years or so, for Russia is really with Europe. I mean, the size of the European market, the connections, the complementarities in terms of energy and in terms of imports and so on, that is, that's what we need to solve. And that's what, with these frustrations, because there are so obvious opportunities for Russia to integrate into Europe.
Proximity as well. It's close.
I think we have time for one more question.
Hi. There's a tremendous upheaval and reaction against the status quo across the world now. So you have Trump or Sanders here in the US, you have the rallying cries behind Brexit in the UK. You have
Le Pen in
Le
France.
Pen in France. You have the AfD in Germany. You have an insecure leadership in China. You have Rousseff in Brazil. The list goes on and on. You've had the Arab Spring not so long ago. To what extent does Russia face similar threats? The Russian establishment face a similar threat? And if not, why not?
Good question.
Well, I think there's an argument that is what drives a lot of the political environment in Russia, and maybe some of the actions that the Kremlin has taken. They're very cognizant of what has occurred, certainly the Arab Spring. This often comes up. And the question earlier about why did Russia react the way it did around Crimea and Ukraine, they are very concerned about regime change.
State Department is on the record. They spent $5 billion to promote democracy in Ukraine. So I mean, it's very close to the border. So I mean, I think they're absolutely very cognizant.
But it's very similar to what some of the responses you've seen in China. In terms of NGOs, in the news just a few days ago, their censorship of the internet, similar concerns.
Well, I'm not here about politics. I can only speak about economics.
That's for next year's panel.
There's another question.
All right, one more. Yeah.
Can we touch on a topic of Russian oligarchs, because it's just such a fascinating topic. Everybody loves discussing it. And obviously through the few last years, we've seen a huge outflow of capital out of Russia. So the Russian oligarchs now are a lot more involved with actually making investments abroad. They're becoming more and more influential here. But now, obviously, with how the economy is doing, and Mark, you said that actually if you know what you're doing and you've done it for the past 30 years, it's a good opportunity to be in Russia. So do you see the capital coming back? I know there's a lot of legislation that was put in place for de-offshorization, for promoting people to bring the capital back. Did you see any influence? If so, what is the influence? Are they coming back? Are they investing back? And how would you like to see that?
Well, maybe I will start with the capital outflow story, because you need to understand it from the economic point of view. All the outflows that we had, for example, in the past 12 months is the repaying of the external debt. So it's only this. Now the households were turning back to the domestic currency. We see inflows, FDIs, some FDIs coming in. But all the outflows, it's just the repaying the bank loans, the Eurobonds, and all the stuff that we've borrowed previously. So it's only about it.
I mean, I would say I spent a lot of time working with oligarchs in my professional capacity, and it's sort of a mixed story. A lot of the big guys who made a tremendous amount of money, in the 90s and the early part of the century, are obviously concerned about the political climate. They would like to hedge their bets, and they see, in many cases, more attractive opportunities overseas, whether it's in technology and so forth. And so they are moving their money out, or have moved it out, and looking to invest elsewhere in the world. But by the same token, the investment climate is so attractive now because of sanctions, because of the political environment, because of the high margins that they can earn domestically, and because they understand Russia so well. We are seeing quite a number of them saying, gee, there are sectors that I would really like to invest in, whether it's retail or agriculture, where they can really derive meaningful returns. And so I'm seeing them move into those spaces, but it's selective.
I think we have to finish now, and thank you so much for coming, everyone.